Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're talking about another acronym aneurysm. This is the GPR-BR build in the 14565C. Anyways, this is the general purpose battle rifle in the often controversial 14.5-inch 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, I already have a video on the theory behind 14.5-inch 6.5 Creedmoor, but if you're interested in checking that out in a little bit more detail, you can go ahead and check out the dedicated video on that. As of right now, the very basic idea is that you get 20-inch 308 ballistics with less recoil, size, and weight. This video is mostly going to be going over the setup, which is in its semi-final configuration, though there are a handful of these parts that can be swapped out for a variety of others to suit your specific needs. Starting off with the heart and soul of this build is the barrel. This is a 14.5-inch Deadshot custom heavy barrel. Very importantly, because this is a custom barrel, I was able to select 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel versus the more often used 416R stainless steel. My supposition is that 416R stainless steel might be the slightly more accurate steel over a wide variety of ammunition loads that might be anywhere from 5 to 10% more accurate overall, though again, that's going to vary greatly between barrel to barrel and load to load. However, in my somewhat heavy use consideration, I do want to make sure that I have a barrel that can hold up to some of the abuse being thrown through it. So to prolong the accuracy and the barrel life, I am using a slightly more hard-use steel in 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel. Now, because this is a custom profile, I went with a very heavy profile, which again, depending on how you want to use the system, this is an area where you might change it to be a little bit lighter to suit your specific needs. My barrel is a 14.5-inch heavy profile barrel with a .875 gas block journal, meaning that this is a very heavy barrel, coming in somewhere at about 3 pounds. I could have very easily swapped it to a SOCOM profile barrel, which would have been a little bit lighter with a .750 gas block journals to be a little bit more balanced and to not have so much weight out at the end. But again, I wanted a more accuracy focused build, and again, if I am going to use it for long strings of fire, it's also going to take a little bit longer for that barrel steel to heat up and hopefully make it last a little bit longer as well. But again, this is an area where you can definitely fine-tune it to meet your specific needs. Now, moving on to the upper receiver and handguard set, these two components on my build are inseparable because I am using the Aero M5 enhanced upper receiver and their enhanced handguards. With the upper receiver, you get a aluminum extension that the handguard actually bolts to, so it does not bolt to the barrel nut whatsoever. In fact, you have a steel barrel nut on the inside that torques the barrel to the upper receiver. So again, the handguard does not touch the barrel nut whatsoever, meaning that you get a truly free-floated system, which in theory can help out a little bit in the accuracy and consistency department, as well as when you're very heavily loaded up on a bipod, can help to reduce your point of impact shift. Because I plan to use this rifle all the way out to 1200 yards, yes, in this 14.5-inch barrel, I wanted to make sure that I have as little point of impact shift at those extended ranges as possible, while having a rock solid, rigid mounting platform for all of my accessories. Now, that's the good part about it. The bad part about it is that the rail is very thick, it's very fat, meaning that some accessories won't quite mount perfectly just because of the diameter of the handguard. For instance, this 45-degree adapter on the light is not quite mounted properly, and you could also run into issues with certain laser aiming modules or anything else that you're putting on the top Picatinny rail. This is definitely a trade-off for my specific setup, and again, this is another component that you can change for your specific system. Now, my rail is very long, again, maximum stability with a bipod, and the barrel and muzzle device are actually recessed a little bit behind the end of the handguard. It's not hurting the handguard whatsoever, and again, the handguard is thick enough to accept a suppressor, so I'm not having any sort of suppressor or muzzle device compatibility issues. Now, moving on to the recoil system, this is 100% tuned to work together. I have 4 different components starting at the front and all the way to the back to mitigate recoil as much as possible to allow me to shoot as quickly as I can up close, and of course also maintain a high rate of fire at distance and maintain a very high level of accuracy, which we'll get into in just a minute. Starting out up front, we have the Reardon dual port brake, which also doubles as my suppressor mounting device, It's a very solid suppressor mounting system and also a very, very effective muzzle brake, meaning that you get very little recoil. And again, if I'm not trying to reduce my signature as much as possible with a suppressor, then I'd like to have as little recoil as possible. So it's kind of a dual role in that light. Now moving directly behind there, we have the Aero Precision detent adjustable gas block. This will again tune the system, tune the barrel to run just about whatever I want. Now from the factory, the 14.5 Deadshot custom barrel was gassed, probably just a little bit more than what it needs, but it probably could be fixed with just a few other components. So it doesn't necessarily need an adjustable gas block, but for my situation where I'm going to be going between suppressed and unsuppressed, on the unsuppressed setting, I want it to be tuned down as much as possible so that when I do throw on a suppressor, it doesn't drastically overdrive the system and then start causing malfunctions. Behind there, we have a incredibly lightweight BCG for an AR-10. Now this is still an 8620 carrier, 9310 bolt, full black nitride on everything. This is actually from RTB, and the entire carrier for a standard DPMS pattern BCG weighs right at 13 ounces, which is only about an ounce and a half more than what you're getting on a standard mil-spec 5.56 BCG. This component alone, going from about a 19 ounce standard DPMS BCG weight all the way down to about 13 ounces, drastically changes the way that the rifle feels. The reduction in recoil is immediate. It returns to your point of aim much, much faster than before, allowing for much faster follow-up shots and just overall a much more comfortable system. Anytime you're cutting about 30% of the weight off of your BCG, you're going to increase your bolt velocity. Now, in front of the BCG, we have an adjustable gas block to modulate that as much as possible and keep the bolt velocity in a reasonable realm. But then the last bit of recoil mitigation is behind it. I have a CAC K-Spec A5 buffer tube, which is a slightly longer buffer tube. Originally, this rifle had a standard carbine tube and a Shorty 308 buffer, which was doing as much as it could, but it's certainly much better in its current configuration with, again, the longer tube. Now for the buffer, we're using a K-Spec H3 buffer, so it's a standard length buffer, but has a dual stage spring and is again right at about 5.5 ounces. In terms of the spring, we're using the CAC rifle length flat wire spring, and that combination will do as much as it can to slow down the BCG from the backside. So we're limiting the amount of flow on the front with an adjustable gas block and then putting a heavy buffer and strong spring combo behind to keep that bolt velocity, again with our very lightweight BCG, keeping the whole system operating in a very reliable, at this point perfectly reliable way, while also mitigating that recoil as much as possible. Now the last little component is a breech charging handle. It's an ambidextrous charging handle. It doesn't really matter. I personally prefer the Aero breech charging handles or really any other charging handle on the market, but since I only really use it once per day, I don't really care about it all that much. Just get something that works well with the optic combo of choice. Now, speaking of optics, currently I have the Arken EP8, which is a 1:8 first focal plane LPVO on here, and I did take this all the way out to 900 yards with a combination of dialing and holdovers within the reticle, which I do not recommend. That is quite silly and probably beyond the operating window of the Arken EP8, but it does technically work. Up close, perfectly fine. Again, the recoil mitigation in this system is fantastic to shoot, and at distance, you can keep one shot per second at about 600 yards, which is fantastic. You can keep multiple shots in the air at the same time, even for someone like me, who is a bit of a noob when it comes to quote-unquote long-distance shooting. In the air at the same time, baby. That's what you get with this sort of system, right? Especially when you're using it with some ammo that really works, man. It just absolutely slaps. That last one was a miss, but that was 4 in a row. Last one I pulled underneath, just missed the target. I will have a dedicated video on the Arken EP8 coming up shortly, so stay tuned for that. Not featured here, but is generally recommended is either a offset red dot or a top mounted red dot, something to give you a little bit of redundancy and a emergency aiming point if needed. As I've mentioned several times throughout this video, when it comes to actually using this thing, it is insanely fun. This feels like shooting 7.62 by 39 or some sort of other intermediate caliber. Yes, of course, it still has more recoil than 5.56. The reciprocating mass is only slightly more at, again, about 11.5 up to 13 ounces in this specific BCG. Combined with everything else that we're doing to mitigate the recoil, it feels fantastic to shoot up close. It's basically a laser beam. You can shoot this basically as fast as you want with a little bit of recoil control, and even at distance, you can maintain a very high rate of very accurate fire. And now, one major advantage of this system versus 5.56 is at those kind of mid-range distances, let's say 600 and 700 yards, I can fire this very quickly, very accurately, similarly to 5.56, but as opposed to 5.56 where I'm worrying about wind drift or switches and stuff like that, with 6.5 Creedmoor with 147 grain ELDMs, I literally don't care, just put it on the target and pull the trigger. Now, getting into accuracy, at this point I've probably spent about $300 on different ammo types to see which one would function the best, so that was fun. But the best loads that I personally found were the Hornady 147 grain ELDM, and actually the most accurate was the Federal Premium 140 grain Sierra Match King. However, the BC is much lower and the velocity is also a lot lower. I was getting significantly more drop at distance. So even though there was a slight, very, very slight accuracy penalty with the Hornady 140 grain ELDMs and 147 grain ELDMs, I will probably be using both of those to do my extreme long, quote-unquote long range shooting at about 1,000 to 1,200 yards coming up shortly. And with the S&B 140 grain ball ammunition, I was getting anywhere from about 2.5 to 3 MOA, which for me is perfectly fine, especially out to say 500 or 600 yards. You're still going to be able to make very effective hits, and again with a lot more energy and higher BC than 5.56. Not to mention that ammo was about 80 cents a round, so I can't really complain about the accuracy and functionality of it. Now, talking about reliability, there were a couple odd quirks every now and again. On some of the really long bullets, the 140 and 147 grain ELDMs, on the second round in the magazine, they didn't always want to feed. Now, that was only when I loaded 5 rounds in the magazine for either accuracy or distance testing. If I loaded them up to, say, 10, 15, or 20, then they would feed perfectly fine. But when I was doing 5 rounds at a time, sometimes that second round just wouldn't quite load. Now, that's specifically with the Duramag magazines. In the Magpul magazines, everything was perfectly fine. And for whatever reason, my lower does not like the Lancer mags, so your mileage may vary a little bit with your specific setup. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that I did try the Callaway Ballistics 6.5 Creedmoor. In fact, I have about 100 rounds of it here, and it just really didn't like to feed, and it wasn't that accurate in my rifle. They say that it works a lot better in bolt guns, but I just could not get it to run well in this barrel whatsoever, so I kind of just gave up. Now, as for what's coming next with this system, I am again going to be testing its limits as far as distance, pushing it out to hopefully around 1,200 yards with the 147 grain ELDMs. And other than that, I'm just going to continue shooting it and using it until I get to a point where accuracy starts to degrade, which is probably going to cost me about $3,000. So yeah, stay tuned for that sort of thing. So with all of that out of the way, guys, let me know what you think of my 14.5-inch 6.5 Creed GPBR in the comments down below. Dear, my brain's not braining anymore, but go ahead and let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.